Welcome back to the show, everyone. Today we're going on a deep dive into the life and times of one of the most important figures in English literature.
One of the greats.
That's right, Geoffrey Chaucer. You probably know him as the father of English literature.
Right.
But his story goes way beyond just the Canterbury Tales.
It really does. His life was incredible, full of all these twists and turns, pandemics, wars, rebellions, and,
He saw it all.
he saw it all. And we're lucky enough to have a great episode of The Rest is History to help us unpack all of it. So,
Excellent. I'm ready. Let's dive in.
okay.
So, first things first. Chaucer was born around 1342 and died in 1400.
Okay.
So that puts him right smack in the middle of the reigns of Edward III and Richard II.
Yeah, a really interesting period in English history. Lots of change happening.
Intense change. And Chaucer's own life kind of mirrors all that change, too.
Yeah, absolutely. Like his family, for instance, they were part of this big upward mobility that was happening in England back then.
But really? They weren't like nobility or anything?
No, not at all. His father was a wine merchant.
So how do they climb the social ladder then? Just good business sense.
Well, a little bit of luck was involved too. See, they just happened to move to Southampton right before the Black Death hit London.
Oh, wow. Talk about dodging a bullet.
Right. And then because so many people died in the plague, they ended up inheriting property from relatives, and that gave them the money to really elevate their social standing.
Wow. So they were in the right place at the right time in a way.
You could say that. It was definitely a time of great upheaval, but also of opportunity.
So Chaucer gets this financial boost and he ends up in the royal court, right?
Exactly. He started as a page for Lionel, Duke of Clarence, who was the third son of Edward III.
So he's rubbing elbows with royalty now.
He is, and that gave him access to a whole world of power and privilege.
And I read that he even traveled to France with the king during the Hundred Years' War.
Yeah, that's right. He did. And
Wait, so he actually fought in the war?
he did. He was even captured
Yeah.
and then ransomed by the king himself.
Oh, wow. That's incredible. I bet that experience really stayed with him.
Oh, definitely. You can see the impact of those war experiences in some of his writing in the Canterbury Tales, especially The Knight's Tale.
That makes sense. War is something you don't just forget about.
Yeah.
But his life wasn't all battles and bloodshed, right? He got to travel to some pretty interesting places, too.
Oh, for sure. He went on these diplomatic missions to places like Navarre and Italy.
Sounds much nicer than being a prisoner of war.
Haha, yeah, I'd say so. And these trips were really important for him because he got to experience all this new literature and ideas.
Like what kind of ideas?
Well, one of the big things was that he encountered writers who were using vernacular languages, like Italian and French instead of just Latin.
Ah, so that's where he got the idea to write in English.
It definitely had a big influence on him because up until then, most literature was written in Latin, which meant it was only accessible to a small group of educated people.
Right, so by writing in English, Chaucer was making literature accessible to a much wider audience.
Exactly. And that was a revolutionary idea at the time. He was helping to shape the future of English literature.
What a pioneer. And it paved the way for all the greats who came after him, like Shakespeare and Dickens.
Yeah, it's hard to overstate his impact. But let's talk about his most famous work, The Canterbury Tales. It's not just a collection of stories, is it?
It's more like a snapshot of life in 14th century England.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
It's social commentary at its finest. The way he uses the framing device of a group of people on a pilgrimage is just brilliant.
It's like he's saying, hey, let's gather all these different people from different walks of life and see what happens.
Exactly. You've got a knight,
Yeah.
a miller, a prioress, a wife of Bath. It's like a cross-section of medieval society.
And he doesn't shy away from blurring the lines between fiction and reality either.
Right. Like
Yeah.
he even puts himself in the tales as this terrible storyteller.
Yeah, I love that. It's like he's poking fun at himself.
Oh, totally. And then the way he uses the tales to challenge social hierarchies.
Yeah, like that scene where the miller interrupts the monk.
Oh, yeah. The drunken miller just barges in and starts telling this body story. It's hilarious and it's totally unexpected.
And I bet it was pretty scandalous back then.
Oh, I'm sure it was. But that was Chaucer's genius. He was shaking things up. He was saying that the old rules didn't apply anymore.
And then you've got the wife of Bath.
Oh, the wife of Bath. She's amazing.
Yeah.
Strong, independent, and not afraid to speak her mind.
A real feminist icon for the Middle Ages.
Absolutely. Her tale is all about a woman's right to control her own life and her own body. It was very forward-thinking for the time.
So Chaucer was really in tune with all these changes that were happening in society. The shifts in power,
Yeah.
the breakdown of traditional hierarchies.
Oh, yeah, for sure. And his own life reflected that, too. Like
Yeah.
his granddaughter, Alice, She became incredibly wealthy and powerful through her multiple marriages.
Really?
Yeah. She ended up being the aunt of the princes in the tower.
No way. Those are the two little boys who disappeared under Richard III.
Exactly. It's a chilling connection, right?
It really shows you how even Chaucer's own family was caught up in the drama of the time.
Oh, yeah, for sure. But let's sort back to his legacy for a minute. Because he didn't just revolutionize the English language, he gave us a timeless portrait of the human condition.
Exactly. He had this amazing ability to capture the essence of what it means to be human. The joys, the sorrows, the struggles, the triumphs.
And he did it with humor and wit and compassion.
Yeah.
And that's why we're still reading him today.
Absolutely. He's a timeless genius.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Makes you wonder what it would have been like to live in Chaucer's world. I mean, to see all that change happening right before your eyes.
It must have been incredible. And that's what makes the Canterbury Tales so fascinating. You really get a sense of what life was like back then.
Yeah. It's like you're right there with those pilgrims traveling to Canterbury, hearing their stories, sharing their meals.
Exactly. And the way Chaucer captures the dynamics between them, the humor, the drama, the little squabbles, it's all so real, so human.
Yeah. Even after all these centuries, we can still relate to those characters and their problems.
Right, because human nature hasn't really changed all that much. And that's what makes Chaucer so brilliant. He was a master observer of human nature.
Absolutely. And remember, he wasn't writing for the elite. He was writing for everyday people in their own language.
That's a really important point because it shows how he was trying to bridge social divides with his work.
Yeah, he was a true innovator. But let's get back to the Canterbury Tales for a minute, because it's not just a great work of literature. It's also a valuable historical document.
Oh, absolutely. It gives us this incredible glimpse into 14th century England. And one of the things that stood out to me when we were listening to that episode of The Rest is History was the idea of seeking cures.
Oh, yeah, right.
Mhm.
The whole premise of the Canterbury Tales is that these pilgrims are traveling to the shrine of Thomas Becket, hoping for miracles and healing.
Right. And that was a huge thing in the Middle Ages. Pilgrimages were incredibly popular. People would travel for miles to visit these sacred sites.
It's like the medieval version of a wellness retreat.
Uh-huh. Yeah, I guess you could say that. But with higher stakes, people were really looking for divine intervention.
I mean, when you're living in a world with plague and war and all sorts of other dangers,
Yeah.
it makes sense that you'd turn to faith for comfort.
Exactly. And Chaucer captures that mix of hope and desperation really well in the tales.
Yeah, some of the pilgrims, like the partner,
Mm-hmm.
are obviously just in it for the money.
Oh, yeah. He's this
Yeah.
total charlatan.
Yeah.
But then you have characters like the knight and the parson who seem to genuinely believe in the power of pilgrimage.
Right. It's like he's showing us the whole spectrum of human belief.
Yeah. And he's also highlighting this idea that people are always searching for something to make sense of the world, to find meaning in their lives.
And sometimes that search takes them on literal journeys,
Yeah.
like the pilgrimage to Canterbury. But there were also these metaphorical journeys happening at the same time, right?
Oh, definitely. Society was going through this huge transformation in the 14th century.
Yeah, it was a time of great upheaval. The Black Death, the Peasants' Revolt, the 100 Years' War.
Right. And all of that is reflected in the Canterbury Tales, like the way Chaucer plays with social hierarchies.
Oh, yeah. He's constantly subverting expectations. Like when the miller interrupts the monk.
That's such a great example. You have this drunken miller who just pushes his way to the front and starts telling this bawdy story.
It's so out of place and so funny.
It really is. And it's such a deliberate choice on Chaucer's part. He's showing us that the old order is breaking down.
Yeah, the traditional power structures are being challenged,
Yeah.
and he's giving a voice to the marginalized and the overlooked.
Right, like the wife of Bath and the pardoner. They get to tell their stories too, even if they're not always what you'd expect from people of their social standing.
It's like he's creating this space for dialogue and debate across social boundaries.
Exactly. And in doing so, he's capturing the energy and dynamism of a society that's on the cusp of change.
It makes you wonder if Chaucer was trying to make a statement about the political climate of his time.
Yeah.
I mean, he lived through the Peasants' Revolt, which was a pretty
Yeah.
big deal.
Oh, yeah, that was a major turning point in English history. And there are definitely hints of that social unrest in the Canterbury Tales.
Like what?
Well, there's that chilling line in the Nun's Priest's Tale where he talks about the violence directed at Flemish immigrants during the revolt.
Oh, yeah. Jack Straw and all his followers in their brawl were never half so shrill for all their noise when they were murdering those Flemish boys.
That's exactly. It's a stark reminder of the dark side of human nature. And it suggests that Chaucer wasn't just writing from a place of detachment. He was deeply affected by the events he witnessed.
It was his reality, his world. And he was using his writing to process it all, to make sense of it.
And that's one of the things that makes his work so powerful. It's not just entertainment, it's a reflection of his own life and times.
And it speaks to us across the centuries. Because even though our world is different in so many ways, we still face the same fundamental challenges.
Right. The struggle for justice and equality, the search for meaning and purpose, the desire for connection and love.
And Chaucer captures all of that with such honesty and compassion.
It's like he's saying, look, this is what it means to be human. This is what it's like to live in a world that's full of beauty and pain and everything in between.
And that's why we're still reading him today.
Yeah.
Because his work is timeless. It transcends the boundaries of time and place.
I couldn't agree more.
Yeah. It's like we're all on this big pilgrimage trying to find our way in the world.
I like that. And speaking of pilgrimages, we were talking earlier about how the pilgrims in the Canterbury Tales are on this journey to Canterbury Cathedral, and how it's not just about the physical travel, but also about seeking something deeper.
Right. They're looking for miracles and healing at the shrine of Thomas Becket.
Exactly. And that idea of seeking cures both physical and spiritual is really central to the tales.
So the pilgrimage becomes this metaphor for the spiritual journey.
Right. It's about trying to find meaning and purpose in a world that can often feel chaotic and unpredictable.
And Chaucer shows us all the different ways people approach that search. Some are driven by faith, some by desperation, some by greed.
Yeah, he's not afraid to show us the flaws and contradictions of human nature. Even the most devout characters have their moments of weakness.
That's what makes them so real, so human.
Exactly. And it's what makes Chaucer such a brilliant writer. He understood that we're all just trying to figure things out.
And that we all make mistakes along the way.
For sure. But it's also about learning from those mistakes and trying to be better.
Right. And it's about finding hope even in the darkest of times.
Exactly. Which brings us back to Chaucer himself, because he was a man who lived through some pretty tough times.
I mean, plague, war, political upheaval, you name it, he saw it.
And yet he still managed to find beauty and humor in the world.
You can really feel that in his writing.
Oh, definitely. Even when he's dealing with serious subjects, there's always this underlying sense of optimism.
It's like he's saying, hey, life is tough, but we can get through it together.
Yeah, and that's a message that's still relevant today.
Absolutely. So as we wrap up this deep dive, what are some key takeaways you'd like our listeners to remember about Chaucer?
Well, I think the biggest thing is that he was more than just a writer. He was a witness to history.
Yeah, he lived through some of the most tumultuous events of the 14th century.
Exactly. And he used his writing to capture the spirit of his age.
He was a keen observer of human nature and a master storyteller.
Absolutely. And his work is still relevant today because it speaks to our shared humanity.
It reminds us that we're all connected, even across the centuries.
And that stories have the power to bring us together.
Beautifully said. Well, thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive.
It was my pleasure.
And for our listeners, be sure to subscribe to the show and join us next time for another fascinating exploration of history. Until then, keep on reading and keep on exploring.